I have built a lot of decks over the years. I'm a brewer at heart, and I am constantly putting together and taking apart many decks. But there are some that have stuck around for a while. Today I wanted to talk about the commander decks I play right now, and a few that got scrapped. So if you ever wondered what it would look like if you played games against me at your local game store, stick around, you'll see the decks that I play. Or I guess you could join the Patreon. I play games with patrons all the time, so you could get in the game that way. Additionally, there is a reason why I'm making this video now, which I'll talk about later. Before I get into it, if you want to buy some of the decks that I play, or if I inspire you to build a commander deck, check out Cool Stuff Inc. They got lots of singles and sealed product. If you use code TTM, you'll get a discount and it supports the channel. Thanks to Cool Stuff Inc. for sponsoring the video. I'm going to start with the decks that I've had for the shortest amount of time, and then go from there to the ones that I've had for years. I also want to talk about some restrictions I have on my EDH decks. It might help you understand why I've chosen certain things. One thing I do is I avoid any commanders on EDH Rec's top 100 most popular. If you go to top commanders on EDH Rec, you'll see the most played commanders on the site. This is why I don't run Shorakai as my artifact deck right now. I had one and then it hit the list and I scrapped it. In the same hipster vein, I also don't run the most popular commander for any individual color combination. My second restriction is that the theme of the deck should not be obvious when looking at the commander itself. So with my Tawnos deck, yes, it is an artifact deck, but there's a hidden commander in there. Or Tymna Jeska is a goad deck, when you might have not realized that goad was the theme. I'll know that I have succeeded in this when I'm able to go to EDH Rec and add 3 cards to the search, and then find 0 decks that match. Or maybe 1 if it's my list that shows up. Hey, real quick editing trinket here. When I was getting this screenshot and filtering, I saw 2 other decks that were inspired by mine, which is really cool. I think it's awesome that you guys take my decks and put your own spin on it. Hopefully you'll do more of that after this video. My third restriction is within my 5 casual decks, I don't want any overlapping color combinations. So if I have a Gruul deck, I'm not also going to make a Jund list. This is just to make my decks more varied so they don't share as many cards. It also helps with card resources as well. If I have 1 shock land, I don't need to then get another shock land. I will sometimes break this color overlapping rule if I build a 5 color deck. Lastly, I want all 5 colors represented among my 6 decks. I also used to have a rule about playing partners, but my opinion on the partner mechanic has changed over time, so that rule's gone. I got like half a script written about why. It might be a future video. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, I recently cut Sol Ring, Rhystic Study, Mana Crypt before the ban, and some other generic value cards from all of my decks. Here's a card to the video explaining why, if you're wondering. With all that said, let's talk about the decks. Foxglove is up first. This commander is so cool. I really wanted to play this commander just to make use of cards I don't like. Political cards like Secret Rendezvous and Cut a Deal, for example. I went into building this deck with the assumption that these cards are not good. So I made a whole deck around cards I don't like. Plus, I really wanted to play Bant Control. Honestly, I need to test the deck more, it's still pretty new. The idea of politics control is really fun, but I'm not 100% sold on these cards yet. I plan on doing more testing with this and making a longer video about this deck sometime in the future. And then it's probably gonna get scrapped. I'll talk about that more later. But if you want to try this list out, it basically plays like a Legacy Delver deck. Essentially, you want to stick 1 big threat and ride it to victory. Basically, untap with your commander, and use it to cheat out some big, evasive, card advantage-y threat. And then keep that threat alive as best you can. There are some other cute things you can do, like Secret Rendezvous an opponent, dump your hand, swing at them, refill, and then use a silence effect like Orm's Chant to make it so that player can't cast spells on their turn, and just can't use any of the cards you gifted them. Other than that, it's really just Bant Control with big dudes as finishers, and it's pretty fun to swing in with big dudes. Tymna Jeska is next. This deck has been such a blast to play. Jeska is a really interesting card, able to triple the combat damage from 1 specific creature. Oftentimes, it's used to power up your own creature for big damage. Or you could use it as an infinite mana outlet, because it can just kill itself, dealing damage to your opponent, and then you cast it infinitely. But that's not really relevant for my list. With this deck, I'm using goad cards. You put a goad enchantment to buff up a creature, and then use Jeska to triple the damage. It's really fun and can end some games quite fast. And then Tymna is how I keep up on cards. The deck plays a lot of small, low-power evasive creatures, allowing me to chip in for utility effects and card draw because of Tymna. Then, late game, using the evasive creatures, you can use Jeska to triple their damage and chunk in at your opponents. The deck also uses Break Through the Lines, which is one of my favorite cards, as a way to cheaply and efficiently get these dinky creatures in at my opponents. Honestly, I've been going back and forth on these two halves of the deck, Goad and just straight aggro. I've been debating whether or not I want to lean more aggro or goad politics. If you check out the list, leave some suggestions in the comments. Next is OG Heliod. There was a time where I wanted to build draw-go control in the worst color combination for that theme, so I played mono-red control. But with Jeska's Will and Underworld Breach and the late Dockside, mono-red was actually pretty good. Even without the Dockside, you have some powerful cards these days. So it was kind of easy enough to build a red control deck. So I swapped to mono-white. Heliod is my take on mono-white control. The idea is this commander draws infinite cards as soon as you cast it. Kinda. With Heliod, you have an infinite amount of 4 mana 2/1 clerics with flash and probably vigilance. This is what's called virtual card advantage. It's not that we're literally drawing cards, but we're using mana and gaining advantage as if we were. And don't get me wrong, a 4 mana 2/1 with flash is not a spectacular creature, but having an infinite number of them is pretty good. This allows me to hold up my mana and flash in a attacker on an end step, or flash in a blocker when I get attacked. On this week's podcast, Snail talked about being able to create pressure without committing more to the board, and that's what this deck aims to do. If you have something to buff up those tokens, then I can just keep activating the ability and continue to be a threat without committing anything else to the board. Just my commander and 1 Divine Visitation means I now have infinite 4 mana 4/4 flying vigilance creatures with flash and essentially uncounterable. This lets me block and attack really easily. I can hold up all of my mana for any removal that I might need, and if I don't, every 4 mana I held up is just another 4/4. This list also has a few other stacks cards that it breaks parity with perfectly. Rule of Law is one of the best examples. This card limits everyone to 1 spell a turn. Normally, Spellslinger, instant, and sorcery-based decks are pretty hard to beat in mono-white, so this card can shut those down. But remember, my infinite number of cards that I have is tied to an activated ability. I'm not actually playing any cards, so while my opponents might be limited to 1 spell a turn, I can still activate my commander as many times as I want, as long as I got the mana. There's a few other stacksy kind of cards in there, like Crackdown, which is basically one-sided in this deck. And I have a few other finishers, like Humility plus Opalescence, which is one of my favorites. Humility is actually my favorite card of all time. I also recently changed all the lands in the deck to basic planes, allowing me to use Endless Horizons to remove all of them from my deck. And then Goblin Charbelcher lets me blast a player out of the game once my deck has no lands in it. I've really been loving this deck. Utilizing the activated ability to grind value while holding up mana is exactly what I want from draw-go control. It's really funny when people see me play this deck, since I will often just draw, play my land, and hold up 8 mana as if I was playing mono blue. It's just so antithetical to mono white, I love it. I wanted to do 2 quick honorable mentions before I talk about the 3 decks I've played the longest. A while ago, I built a Thrasios Tormod deck. I had talked about the list a little bit in some videos, and I had gotten multiple requests on those videos or on Moxfield to explain what the heck this deck is doing. So I thought I'd do that here. And there'll be a link to this deck as well in the description. Basically, it's a Sultai control deck, but using creatures with channel for value. This deck wants to first ramp with Thrasios, get a ton of extra mana into play, and whatever other green ramp I have. Then find some channel cards, ideally the one which is a counterspell. Then play some way to get those channel creatures out of the bin, and assuming you have the mana, anything can now be countered. Then Tormod will give you a zombie army as a reward for doing this, and that's how the deck would win. The deck had a few cute value packages: Chalk Outline, Oval Chase Daredevil, Tortured Existence, and a channel card, let you loot back whatever you wanted as long as you had the mana. There were other things like Cat Oven or Book Oval Chase, which were little engines to gain life and make zombies for extra value. The deck was unique in its design, but not in its play pattern. Yes, using channel creatures as your spells in a control deck is pretty wacky, but in terms of gameplay, this deck was ultimately no different than any other control deck that used regular instants or sorceries. Functionally, the deck was just a regular control deck, which is why I ended up taking it apart. One more commander I want to give an honorable mention to is Tawnos. I have built and taken apart some version of Tawnos like 10 times at this point. I wanted to share a few ideas in hopes of inspiring one of you to maybe try them out. One was just pure stacks. If you got a high power playgroup, maybe give it a try. This commander is amazing after one of those big red destroy everything cards. Tawnos helps you draw into more lands and snipes any cheap mana dorks your opponents might get after you blew up all their lands. It just helps you rebuild so much faster after one of these effects and get way ahead of the rest of the table. Another fun idea was one where I made my deck with 0 creatures and 0 enchantments, other than Omniscience. Then I could use cards like Reweave to cheat the massive enchantment into play. I didn't run any combos in it either, it was just pure control where all my counterspells were free. So those are a few Tawnos lists to think about. On to the big 3. These 3 decks are the ones that I have kept around for the longest, and they'll probably stick around for even longer. Salvaging Station is one of my favorite cards of all time. I talk about it all the time. Allowing you to reuse small dinky artifacts like these baubles is really fun. I love using these funny little artifacts so much that my whole channel is named after the card Trinket Mage, which searches up these baubles. And after years of trying different commanders to helm my Salvaging Station deck, I've stuck with Tawnos. This commander is sweet. Not only does it copy the effect of my station, so it's almost a clone of the station, but it also lets me double up my silly baubles. Tawnos is fast and efficient, allowing me to get early extra card draw and sometimes ramp. The card by itself is not very threatening, so he doesn't really soak up removal, and at 2 mana, he's really easy to recast if removed. Yet the late game power of this card is insane. Doubling the ETB or upkeep trigger of a Portal to Phyrexia can be big value, and doubling the removal from a Spinevish Saw or a Cityscape Leveler can really mess up my opponent's game plan. I'm constantly making changes to this deck and figuring out what's the right win con, what's the right endgame value piece, but it has always been a blast to play. I really just find the big dumb artifacts I like and double the effect. And who doesn't love doubling a fun effect? One of the first Magic events I ever went to was Grand Prix DC back in 2016, and I bought a foil Japanese Mina and Den for $1, and today I still use them as my commander. Of all the decks I talk about here, this is the only one I would classify as genuine high power casual EDH, and that's because it's just ramp and mid-range value. The deck will almost always outvalue any other casual list in the long run, meaning it crushes most casual decks. The only weakness to the deck is honestly combo. I have removal, but my options are limited in these colors, or at least more limited than the other 3 colors are. I get a lot of people asking if this is a landfall deck, but honestly, I wouldn't classify it as one. Yes, there are land packages and landfall things that the deck does utilize, but it's really more built around ramping into powerful creatures. Eye of Ugin is one of the most crucial cards in the entire deck. It only has 3 targets, but each one serves an important purpose. The Great Distortion is often the first one to search up, allowing me to refuel my entire hand. Ulamog is just there as removal, that I can search up with the eye. But Butcher is the most important, since when this creature dies, it shuffles my whole graveyard back into the deck, allowing me to then search up these Eldrazi again. And with High Market, which lets me sacrifice creatures, I can often dodge exile-based removal, making this engine pretty hard to beat. And with my commander letting me play 2 lands a turn and the constant draw from these titans, plus 48 lands in the deck, it's really easy to eventually get enough mana to tutor and cast Kozilek in the same turn. And eventually you'll run out of removal for Kozilek, but I don't run out of Kozileks. I've also been asked so many times if this deck has a haste enabler, because I'll often make a massive board because I have multiple Fields of the Dead, or an Omnath with extra land drops, or just I put multiple Titans in play. But I don't, there's no haste enabler, since once I get 15 plus mana, I can probably just make a massive board every single turn for the rest of the game. I'll have more massive boards than you're gonna have board wipes, I promise. This deck has a few other fun packages. like Glacial Chasm with the commander, or a goofy 6-card combo with Mirror Pool, or the fact that almost any creature in the deck can be tutored up with Fierce Empath and Woodland Bellower, since the Bellower can grab the Empath, which grabs anything big, and then the Empath can get the Bellower, which gets anything small. There's only 2 5-drops in the deck that can't be searched with this package. This deck has a lot of sentimental value to me, and I'll probably never take it apart. But it's not my favorite deck. My favorite deck of all time, and the one that I've had since 2015, is my Jace Vryn's Prodigy High Tide deck. This has been my CEDH deck of choice for almost 10 years now. Even though it is by no means meta, I still jam it at my local CEDH events and even take home a few prizes. This deck is just so fun to pilot. I will literally throw on a YouTube video, pull out my playmat, shuffle up, and goldfish the deck, just playing against no one else, simply so I could see how early I could storm off and go for a win. I've probably goldfished this deck hundreds of times, and I know what you might be thinking. It's a boring Storm deck, right? He's just playing Solitaire. But I assure you, if you've ever played Storm against opponents with premium interaction, it is not even close to Solitaire. Combo decks and Storm are often compared to Solitaire because if you don't play interaction, yeah, they're playing a single player game since you can't do anything about it. But in a CDH pod, everyone's playing the best removal counterspells in the game. So when I goldfish against nobody, yeah, it's Solitaire. It's all about the puzzle. How could I possibly win with these cards in hand? How early can I go for a win here? But when you have 3 opponents, it's totally different. It's not just, can I win with these cards in hand and storm off from here, but can I win with these cards in hand through interaction? Doing things like casting High Tide on my upkeep into the interaction, and then cracking a fetch to get Mystic Sanctuary to put High Tide back on top so I draw it for turn, can feel so rewarding. Timing perfectly when you go for the storm is just as important as knowing how to pilot the storm turn itself. Also, since this is such an outdated, not meta CDH deck, most players never know what the most important card is to counter or how relevant removing a cost reducer could be. If you see my list and you want to give this deck a try, I would recommend proxying it. CDH is very proxy friendly, and goldfish the deck a ton before trying it out. Maybe one day there will be another manual Storm deck that is actually meta in CEDH, which I'll play. But until then, I'm going to stick with Jace. Oh, and I'm sure some people will comment about it. Yes, Krark and Sakashima is manual Storm and meta, but I hate that deck. I tested the deck for a while, and the amount of times that I just lost games because I double flipped tails caused me to just give up on the deck. I need a little more consistency. Whether you're watching this now or 100 years in the future, these decks might have changed a bit. Or a lot, who knows. Usually I try to have one blue control deck, one non-blue control deck, and one non-blue non-control deck in my set of 6, so that should help you determine what these decks are if the list has changed. In terms of changes that might happen soon, Foxglove is on the chopping block. Like I said, I want to do some testing and maybe a video about Foxglove, and I like the idea of politics in blue, but it's just, I don't know if these are the right colors for it. Maybe something in Dimir or Esper. As for Jeska and Tymna, I think the deck is pretty fun as Goad, but I'm considering dropping the Goad stuff and just going straight aggro. I really love the card Break Through the Lines, and might even cut a color to run the new Spooky Doll as my commander. Or maybe I'd change it to a different partner pair. Perhaps an aggro deck with cedh could be perfect. As I alluded to at the start of the video, there's also a reason I'm making this video right now. My 2 podcast co-hosts, 33 Elk and Salubrious Snail, are also making videos about some of their decks that they currently play. In this coming Tuesday's episode of the Magic Mirror podcast, we'll be rating and roasting each other's decks. So if you want to see these 2 goons tell me how bad my decks are, subscribe, hit the bell. The podcast is hosted here on my channel and on Spotify as well. But I also want to hear from you. Seriously, tell me what you think about these decks. Click the link in the description to take a look at the full deck lists. Are they interesting or fun? Would you play them? Have I inspired you to try one of these commanders? Let me know. Thank you so very much for watching. If you've already subscribed and hit the bell, I appreciate it. But if you want to support me further, check out my Patreon. You can play against me and some of these decks, plus you get access to my Discord server and other bonuses, like my tier 3 patrons who are in the credits.